Do I hate that he died? Yes. Am I sad that he died? Yes. Am I mad at God still that he died? If I'm being honest, yeah. However, and I'm also thankful that I've had this experience where now I can relate to other people. Now I can have empathy for other people. It's not either or, it's and, right? You can embrace two polar opposite emotions at the same time.
I was so thankful that you reached out to me and you said, hey, I would love to do a midweek if you're open to it on mental health. And I think for me, I mean, that's such a big part of my story. My mental health journey is such a big part of my story. And sharing it here at LifePoint, you get to see how much it's a part of everyone else's story as well. There's so many people where mental health and mental illness is part of their story or their family's story. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation together. And in the first part of the conversation, really looking at, hey, are there any obstacles to maybe seeking help? Are there things in the church, maybe there's misconceptions or a stigma around mental health, whether that's in the church or in our culture still. And then the second half of our conversation, I'd love to kind of pick apart more of the practical things for folks, like how do I find a therapist or a counselor? How do I know if medication's right? How do I know if my therapist is the right fit? Those sort of things.
Gotcha.
So really looking forward to diving into both things. But before we kind of head into like, hey, what are some of the misconceptions or the stigma? Can you talk a little bit about your professional career? You speak about this with expertise and experience. So what does that look like?
Okay, so in the state of Maryland, I am a licensed professional counselor. That means that I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, and I've passed the National Counselor exam and have all of my supervised hours. So just this past April, I got my full license. So
wow.
I've been practicing in private practice now for a little over 2 years. And then prior to that, I was a school counselor. So I've kind of seen both. Like I worked in a middle school for a few years and saw kind of how mental health and education kind of are integrated and how that all works. And then decided to kind of jump into the private practice realm, which has been really cool.
Did you wake up one day and think, okay, I'm going to be a therapist? Or was there something in your personal life that led you to say, this is the career that I want to do?
Well, it's interesting you ask that. I think for me, it was kind of like multi-leveled. So originally, if I go way back to my own childhood, I am a person who has anxiety. And nobody ever really put a name to it. It was one of those things where I always felt like I had butterflies or bats in my stomach. I was always just super nervous. I was a big people pleaser. Like I worried about things so much. My grandmother died when I was in 5th grade. And that was the first time I remember like hardcore anxiety. Again, it was, nobody said, oh honey, you have anxiety. But it was like, I couldn't sleep well. All I kept thinking of is, I'm gonna die. Somebody I love is gonna die now. And then that just carried on. So, gosh, it was probably in my 20s, I guess. It was right after my first child was born. And I had like my first like full-on panic attack. Scariest thing ever, right? Pretty sure you're dying, pretty sure you're having a heart attack. And it's like, something's not right. So I went to the doctor and he's like, oh, you have anxiety. I'm like, I have what? And it's like, then all the dots kind of connected. It was like, oh yeah, I do.
Like you could see your whole history.
Yeah.
Like your whole life's history and like, oh, that word fits there and fits there and fits there.
Yeah, like it was kind of like the little link that hooked everything together. And it's weird that having a label kind of is helpful, you know? So from like 20s to like mid 30s, I definitely still struggled with anxiety. Mostly for me, it was worrying I was gonna die. And I would think that I had a disease. I would research the disease. Sure enough, all roads on Google lead to cancer. So I definitely had all of it. And like, you can kind of laugh about it, but you can't, because I literally thought I was going to die.
Yeah.
Like, to the point where I didn't want to get out of bed in the morning, because I knew if I was awake and up, then I had to deal with all the like anxious feelings or whatever. So for a time I went on some medication and started seeing a therapist, not necessarily in that order. Started seeing a therapist first, and then that was helping, but it was like I just needed to kind of come back to like a good baseline, and went on some medication for a while. And, you know, I've had to go on and off of medication a few times. But I would say starting up with therapy for me was so eye-opening. It was like, finally, I can kind of let out all this stuff that I've been holding in so tightly for so long. And it was like a weight was coming off me. And it was such a beautiful experience. And I remember thinking, like, I would love to do this. Like, I would love to switch seats and be in that seat and be able to help people through their stuff. And so I was starting to thinking about that a little bit. But I had 6 kids under 6, and life was crazy. And then my husband passed away in 2008. So my oldest was 12, and my youngest were 5. And it was a car accident. A lot of people, you know the story. But it was in that and helping my kids deal with the trauma of all of that, I think that for me was like, oh my goodness, like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Like, I want to be able to help other people through their trauma, through their pain, to just get on the other side, to kind of cross that bridge from being on one side where you're just like so debilitated by anxiety, depression, your traumas, like whatever, and just help them start to cross that bridge and just feel a little bit more freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, when you said, you know, it's funny that having the name, like having the label, is actually helpful.
Yeah.
And I felt that too. So when I was diagnosed with bipolar, it was like my whole world made sense in that moment. And there was this sense of like, now I know my enemy, right? Because now my enemy has a name.
Yes.
And I think that was like the most, one of the like best times of my life, which is also like one of the hardest times of my life. But having that diagnosis and having a name, say, okay, now I can begin to fight this thing. Now I can begin to manage this thing because now it has a name and it's real, as opposed to just something in my head, or just, you know, something that I've made up, or something that other people can't see. And because it didn't have a name, nobody around me could take seriously. So I think that's so huge.
It is so huge. And I think you feel so alone when you're in your thoughts like that, when you're struggling with anxiety or depression. And then when you have a name for it, you realize, like, this is a thing. Like, you're not just fighting this battle by yourself. Like, there are other people who can relate to you in that way. And I don't know, it's so freeing.
Yeah. When you talk about your journey, and I know from my own, you know, personal journey, discovering, you know, what this mental illness was and discovering like treatment, there were times in my life where I felt like I'm being punished, like God is punishing me. I've done something wrong. And on the flip side, like my mom, she saw what was happening to me and she blamed herself. She said, oh, I must have been a bad parent. I must have done something wrong. You know, maybe I worked too many hours, or if there's somebody that came into your office and they just had this guilt or this shame, or maybe a parent out there who has a child who is managing a mental illness or learning to manage a mental illness, what would you say, like, what's the comfort there of like, hey, this isn't a punishment?
It's hard because I think that our society places such a stigma on mental health that it's one of these like untouchable things, right? And so I think when stuff is clouded in that way, I think that's when shame begins to grow, right? I feel like shame grows in the dark. And I think that whether you're the parent of someone who is suffering with it, whether you are a good friend, the spouse, whatever, I feel like you feel so helpless because it's this thing. And I think that looking at it as there is not a stigma attached to it. right? I mean, if my child had anxiety and I would blame myself for, well, again, like you were saying about your mom, I think that that's all real in a way, right? Like, well, I could have worked less. I could have been home more. That doesn't necessarily guarantee, though, that you still wouldn't have had the stuff that you had. But I think that as a parent, you're doing the best job you can with what you have to work with, right?
Yeah.
And so speaking that and owning that and just opening up that door to let light kind of come in and penetrate that shame is so huge, which is why therapy is so great. Because it's like you're opening these doors of stuff that have been like held onto for so long. And then with that, I think like the mental health stigma, it's like if your child had diabetes, would you feel guilty about that? Like mental health is mental health. There's mental health and physical health, right? And so if your child has a disease, you're not going to blame yourself necessarily for that. Kind of along the same lines with mental health, like it just is.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, not funny, haha, but it's funny that like culturally there is still the stigma of you know, just get it together.
Yeah.
You know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I know for me as a kid, like my family, we didn't have the language to describe the emotions that, you know, we were feeling, I was feeling. And so it was just like, well, because we don't understand it, then just suck it up, you know, and it'll pass. But then the reality is, well, it never really passes. So because you have people around you saying, well, just it'll pass, and then it doesn't, you do feel this like guilt and shame.
Yeah, and you feel like you should be able to like snap your fingers and make it all go away.
Yeah.
And you can't. And that's what's so frustrating too, because you know, you can probably relate to this when you're in the throes of it and it's active and it's terrible and debilitating. You would love nothing more than to snap your fingers and feel better. And so, but you can't.
Yeah.
And so when then people are making comments like, get over it, it's not that bad, don't worry about that, you'll be fine, you know, and then you start to, like you said, you just feel guilt and shame and all of that because you're like, it's not getting better.
Yeah.
What can I do to make this better?
Yeah. How does mental illness develop in a person? Maybe if like we understood, okay, this is actually like what happens and this is what's going on. Could you talk a little bit about how certain mental illnesses or just kind of in general, like how those things develop?
It's kind of like the magic question, right? So like, is it nurture or nature, right? Like, are you born that way or do your circumstances dictate, you know, that you will become this way? I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. If, you know, just from my perspective, I think that, you know, especially if you look at like addiction, I think a lot of times, you know, you can trace it in families. So there is sometimes a predisposition to like an addiction. But then you wonder, or is it that, you know, because the person has grown up in this environment and everyone has kind of catered to the addiction in certain ways, does that then create the development of it? So like I know with anxiety, I wonder like, are we predisposed to it? Or like, does parenting then create anxiety, right? Because I am an anxious person. I know for a fact I've parented my own kids out of anxiety. Oh, be careful there. Oh, wash your hands again. You know, don't touch that, you know. And so then that puts in their minds like, okay, this isn't safe. The world's not safe, right? And so then that makes it kind of tricky. So like, were they predisposed to it or what?
Yeah.
But our biology is fascinating. I mean, God created us. We're wired incredibly. And so, you know, I think that like if you look at anxiety, part of our brain is called the amygdala, which is kind of the alert center in our brain. It's always like searching for danger. So something comes in, there's a bear in the back of the room, the amygdala is going to alert like your whole body, like, hey, there's danger, there's danger, there's danger. So if that's happening enough and you're in that environment where there's a lot of danger, your amygdala is going to be kind of overactive, right? And your cortisol levels and all of your, you know, hormones in your body are always going to be on that like high alert stage, right? So then everything that happens is going to like tip the system off, and your body's going to go into that fight, flight, freeze a lot.
Yeah.
And so sometimes then that just is like this perpetual thing that people are in that constant state. it's like their baseline is like up here instead of just being down here, which is kind of normal. The other thing about that is trauma. Research is showing that trauma is stored in the body. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. And literally all of these events are happening to us, and they're just being stored kind of in our bodies, in our cells. And so how does it all happen? I don't know. Like, again, I think it's a mix, I think, of nurture and nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, from my experience, like I had to accept that was real. Like I had to accept that, like, okay, there are things going on in my brain, things that I can't see but are very real. But I think that's, again, that's what's so hard to talk about it, because there is some mystery still. Especially when you're talking about it in relationship to your relationship with God, as a follower of Jesus. Like, we want hard and fast. We want to be able to see, the problem. And I think the helpful thing for me was understanding, like, we don't have that same attitude towards somebody with a broken leg.
No, at all.
We don't have the same, there's no like brush it off or, suck it up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's like hey, like rest and heal. And
yeah, and you don't feel shame for it. Right, you're not I broke my leg, I'm so humiliated.
Yeah. Have you had to walk people like through that shame? Like, is there hey, you have to get over the shame of feeling this way before we can do therapy? Is that part of that journey?
It is. I think that a lot of the Christian clients who I'm working with, they come in with that. Okay, I've tried reading my Bible. I've tried praying. I've tried journaling. I've tried, having my community group lay their hands on me and pray this away.
Yeah.
I'm meeting with my mentor, and none of this is working. And I'm here now, and I'm hoping you can help. And it's like you can just see their it's like someone has just like injected them with like all of this like stress, tension, guilt, shame, like it's not working. And I think that it's like once we start talking about that, and it's like, okay, but if you had a broken leg, you could read your Bible all you wanted, you could pray all you wanted. Could God heal your broken leg without you getting a cast on it? I mean, he can do anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that he's going to. And I also think that, I don't know that it's that black and white. I don't think that that's what our faith is about. I don't necessarily think like, pray for A will happen. Pray for B will happen. I think it's more about the relationship with God that's built in the process, right? So I know for me, this was what was true. I tried reading my Bible every day. I tried praying, I tried journaling, I tried all the things. It didn't take away the anxiety, but I definitely was in this place where I was clinging to God with desperation, wanting him to fix me. And so once I stopped praying that God would just fix me and started praying that God would deepen my relationship with him through the process of it, it was like, that was kind of the magic part. It wasn't like the rub the crystal ball and like make the anxiety go away. It was more about, oh my goodness, through this valley that I'm in, I have grown so much closer to Jesus. And that's the point. It's like getting to that point, like God's grace is sufficient. Like it might not take it away, but he's going to help you cope with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another great either misconception or stigma to address, because there is that spiritual side of, okay, if I've accepted that this is a reality, then God's going to take it away.
Right.
And that's a really tricky road to go down. Like personally, that's been a dangerous road to go down, because I had that. And so you go, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and it's like, okay, God, why aren't you taking this away? And you have this expectation of one day I'm just going to wake up and everything's going to be better. But that's not always the case.
No, and I don't think that like therapy and healing from mental health is linear either.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like it might be going up, and then something might happen and you just crash again. And then you creep back up a little bit. But all along the way, if kind of faith is kind of like the baseline, right, that you're kind of clinging to, you can still hold on to that even when you fall.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, I mean, it's about the the deepening of relationship? Like, can you go deeper and allow Jesus into that space? Or is that a space where you're like, I don't want anybody in, including Jesus? Like, I don't think he would accept me even in this. And that's just, I think I would want to encourage anybody, like, look, this is a space that Jesus wants to walk through. I mean, this is a guy who sweat blood. He was so anxious, about what it was coming. Like, if anybody gets it, like, he gets it, and he wants to walk with you through that space.
And I can relate to that. I know when I was in the midst of like really early on, like big anxiety struggles, like you said, like I didn't even want to let Jesus into that because there was that shame in a different way because I didn't necessarily have like the right label for it and the right context around it. And it was like, God, can I trust you enough to let you in here? Because if I do, then I'm opening up a whole lot of, what if you don't make me well? What if you don't take this away? Will I still be able to trust you? And so you're right. It's a dangerous, really dangerous place to be.
Yeah. And for me, like the spiritual health and emotional health are so intertwined. And I had, for so long, like I had looked for like Christian counselors, and then then at some point it didn't matter. I was like, I just need, somebody to help me.
Yes, anybody.
But there is this connection of if spiritually, like if I'm not thinking about this well spiritually, then it's going to affect me emotionally. If I think God is mad at me for this, or if I think that this is punishment, like that affects how I'm going to be able to manage this illness, and vice versa. Like if I do think that, like this is punishment, like that's also affecting my spiritual, that spiritual life.
Oh, yeah.
Well.
And then all of a sudden you're in this pit and you can't really see a way out of it.
Yeah.
It's dark.
Yeah. I've been there.
You're like, check.
It's dark. It's dark. It's a dark hole, pit of despair.
And then it changes like your whole self-talk too, right? And then it's just constant. I tell a lot of my clients, it's like this merry-go-round in your brain, and stuff is just going around and around on it, and it cannot get off.
Yeah.
Like it's just digging deeper and deeper.
Yeah, that's absolutely like I'm thinking back, I was like, I did that a number of times where I just get into this spiral, and Brene Brown, she's great. She gave me the language of like shame spiral.
Yes.
And it was like perfect to describe like what was going on. But it was like that when I wasn't taking my medication, or when I just wasn't treating myself well or managing my illness. There was just this huge spiral. And then I'd feel ashamed for getting back to this place again.
Oh, totally. And it impacts everything. Like you were saying, it impacts your emotional health, your spiritual health, your relationships with other people, your own self-care. Like it literally wrecks with everything.
Yeah, they're all intertwined.
They really are. And I think that's why it goes back to like, it's like your whole body. Like it's literally your whole being that's affected and impacted by it. That's why I think mental health is different than physical health sometimes, right? You break your leg. Yeah, like you might be like, oh man, I can't play in that lacrosse tournament or whatever. And that's a bummer and you're kind of sad about it. But your mental health, like literally can impact all those areas.
Yeah. As we're kind of talking about either misconceptions or stigma, I think there is, both culturally and in the church, still a misconception or stigma around medication, and it's part of the treatment plan. Can you talk about the role of medication in a treatment plan? You'd mentioned it a little bit before, but could you go more into that?
You can look at it in a couple ways. I know for a fact there are some prescribers out there who just are writing out prescriptions, right? Like you come to me, you tell me, not to me, but you come to the doctor, you say, hey, I'm having debilitating depression. Okay, take this. Well, it didn't work. Okay, try this one. Okay, it didn't work. Try this one. and you all of a sudden, 6 months has gone by and you've been on 12 different medicines trying to like find the one. There's definitely a time and place for that. I mean, there are people who are, basically crawling to the doctor because they're so desperate. My philosophy is more of, let's try some other stuff first. Let's try some therapy first. Let's try some physical exercise first. Let's try, some other things before we jump to medicine. However, there's definitely a place for medicine. So I think that there's also a way that medicine can work in conjunction with therapy. I think for me personally, I didn't believe that for a long time until I personally experienced it. So it was kind of like I went to therapy. I thought that would fix everything. It didn't necessarily fix everything. So my counselor was like, hey, we're doing all this stuff. I think it might be time for us to kind of consider us adding medication to your treatment plan. Therapists cannot prescribe it. You have to see a doctor for that. So I went to the doctor and I was like, how is this going to help me in therapy though? And so what it does is that medication kind of like reduces a lot of your tension and stress and depression so that you can open up about some of the bigger things that you're kind of holding on to so tightly and start to really do deeper work with a therapist. And that is fascinating and phenomenal all at the same time. So there are some people who don't need to be on it, for the rest of their lives. It's like they've been through a season of a lot of trauma, a lot of change, a lot of transition, and they need to kind of get everything back down to kind of like a good baseline. But there are other people who have certain, mental conditions that they kind of need it. I mean, it's for their safety and health and their ability to be able to just really function in life. And they need it, forever. And that's okay too. But that's where I think having a doctor that you can really, really trust and know that they have your best interest at heart and they're not just trying to push a different pill on you. Like they're looking at your whole case. I love it when doctors reach back out to me as the therapist and we kind of have a conversation where it's like, hey, I'm meeting with so-and-so. This is kind of what I'm thinking. What do you think? And it's great because then, those treatments are integrated. And it's like, okay, I'm helping them in this end, you're helping them in this end, and we're able to kind of communicate about how they're really doing. And that's huge.
I know for me, when I started taking medication, and the reason I would go off my medication at times is because, I didn't want to feel like a zombie. I didn't want it to interfere with my life. But the funny thing is, without it, my life was being interfered with. Like my brain was interfering with my life. So there, not only like culturally, but if that's been a part of your life, like like there's almost a stigma there too of like, I don't want to take medication because I don't want. You read the crazy side effects that are online. Like some of them have weight gain and some of them. So you start saying, I don't want to explore this because I don't want that, like the price is too high for that. Is there like, would you encourage somebody, hey, either stay on your meds or if a doctor's like recommending this and you trust them, like here's the reason?
Yes, for sure. And you're right. A lot of people will take medicine and a lot of times, fun fact, you start the medicine and a lot of them take like a month or more, 6 to 8 weeks before they're actually like fully in your system and actually are working. So people will try it for 2 weeks and be like, I don't feel any better. And then they throw it to the curb. Medicine doesn't work for me, that kind of thing. Or they go on it, they feel better, and 2 months in, or 3 months in, they're like, well, I'm fine now. I don't need to take it. And then they cold turkey go off of it without consulting with anyone. And it's like, okay, no. And I mean, that happens all the time. But I think that's where you go back to a trusted doctor will be the person that's going to be kind of like your biggest ally in this. And also, a general doctor is great about prescribing medicine, but they usually have one or two that they kind of toy with, right? Because that's not their area of expertise. Typically, they're an internist or a general medicine, and that means generally across the board. They kind of see everything from strep throat to, depression. Versus a psychiatrist who is a doctor who's gone to medical school to be a doctor of the brain and mental illness. So they have a whole lot more resources that they're able to kind of tap into because they know that medication. So if you're taking, the basics are Lexapro, Prozac, and Zoloft. Those are the three big ones that kind of get prescribed, but there are so many other ones. So if someone tries Prozac, they're like, it doesn't work. But a psychiatrist is going to know, okay, well, we're going to try this one because this one has, it touches these things in your brain and works in a different way. So their options are more, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I know for me, when I went to a psychiatrist for medication, I specifically said, these are my non-negotiables. I don't want this one. I don't want this side effect. I don't want this side effect. So what can we come up with that can help? And they've got a bigger resource base in that way. So.
Yeah, that's really good. And it brings up a point I hadn't thought of until you were just saying that, of you have professionals in your life that you go and see, but you still have to be your own advocate.
Yes.
So what does it mean to be an advocate for yourself? How would you recommend or how would you encourage somebody to advocate for themselves or a family member?
I mean, you're kind of your own boss in that way, right? So it takes courage to sit with someone who's been trained in this field to say, this is what I want or this is what I don't want. And if they reject that or come off as well, I know better than you, maybe they're not the right doctor or the right professional for you.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Just because you sign up for your first appointment and it doesn't go well, it doesn't mean you have to go back for the second one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of doctors out there, and it's like pizza shops, right? You go to one place and you try their pizza and you don't like it. It's not like you give up pizza forever.
Yeah.
You go and find another one. Now, that being said, it's a lot harder to find a doctor and get an appointment and get on their books or whatever, but you've got to be your own advocate. And sometimes you kind of have to just swallow that fear in that moment and just say, look, this is what I need for me. Or you take someone with you take your spouse with you take a parent with you take your best friend with you to your appointment and say to them, hey, can you be my voice? Because I don't know that I have the courage to stand up and say, this is what I need and this is what I want.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Are there other hang-ups or misconceptions that you see that maybe we haven't covered that you've had to address?
That's a good question. I think, one of them is weakness. There is this thing, this stigma, particularly about men, sorry, but I mean, that if a man comes to therapy, then they're weak. That they should be able, society says a man should be the strong one in the house and they should be whatever. And when I've sat across from a man in my office who is weeping, literally weeping, it's interesting how they're I'm so sorry I cried. I'm so sorry I cried. I'm like, this is where it's your safe place. This is where you're allowed to cry. This is where you're allowed to be real. You don't need to have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And you are not weak for coming and getting help for yourself. You're actually really, really strong.
Yeah.
And I think that there is this pressure that we all have to be just so strong and deal with our stuff and pray about it and just kind of sweep it all under the rug and put on this happy face and go about life and post all your pictures on Instagram and Facebook and make everything look good. And I think that we're hurting so much, I do love Brene Brown for that reason, because she talks a lot about vulnerability and how vulnerability is actually strength. It's not weakness. And I think for so many of us, we've been raised in a way to believe that if we're vulnerable, if we admit that we're struggling, that all of a sudden we're this weak person, and we're so not.
Yeah. I mean, just the courage it takes to say, I need help is, that's a lot. And growing up, there's what it meant to be a man, and then realizing some of those things were toxic, and having to understand there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, and not only for the people around me, but for myself.
Yeah.
And one of those things, feeling I can't tell people that I'm hurting, and I can't sit in front of my therapist and I've sat in front of my therapist and literally just bawled for 20 minutes, like said nothing, just heaving, whatever.
Ugly cry, right?
Ugly cry. And I've done the same thing where I apologize. I'm like, I'm so sorry and I can't get it together, and I keep apologizing. And they're like, what are you apologizing for?
This is why I'm here.
And it's funny because like they'll even get the stern voice of like, don't you dare apologize for this. Like, this is good work here.
Yes.
So I think that's a great one to point out, because it really isn't a weakness.
Exactly. When you were talking to and asking about other misconceptions, the other thing I think I was thinking of too, so I alluded to my husband died. And you were talking about how, God did this to me, God allowed this to happen, God, whatever, with like mental illness or whatever. And I think that's another misconception, is this all or nothing thinking, where it's like, God did this to me, he gave me anxiety, I hate God, like this is awful. My husband died, like that's not fair, I hate God, this is awful. And it's like, you can feel that, and you can also be thankful for some of the experiences, because, all right, me personally, so yes, my husband died. Yes, it was terrible. Yes, I went through a huge spiritual battle with that, emotional battle. Do I hate that he died? Yes. Am I sad that he died? Yes. Am I mad at God still that he died? If I'm being honest, yeah. However, and I'm also thankful that I've had this experience where now I can relate to other people. Now I can have empathy for other people. It's not either or, it's and, right? You can embrace two polar opposite emotions at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge misconception, that you have to be, oh, I'm so happy, I'm so joyful, and not deal with any of this junk over here.
Yeah.
Because this stuff is real, and it's just as real as the joyful parts too, right? So you can be both. And I think that's a huge misconception, that you have to be kind of all or nothing. And that's not the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, when I got to that place, it was the Gospel of John, chapter 9, when the disciples ask, why was this man born blind? Was it because his parents sinned or because he sinned? And Jesus said, neither. And so the work of God could be displayed in him. And at that moment, I felt this incredible freedom to feel both angry and sad and grieved at the years of treatments that didn't work, or, the anxiety, the mania, and to say, yeah, but God can use this to glorify him.
Exactly.
And I think that's the moment where I no longer needed health. I just needed to glorify God. Like, that's the moment I could say, I accept this burden as a way to help others. I think that's like really special.
It is. And I think that marks probably a lot of healing.
Yeah.
When you can look at your life and you can see those two polar opposite things. And it doesn't change the fact, would you have chosen to be born with bipolar and struggle with that your whole life? No. Would I have chosen for Kevin to die in a car accident? No. But do I like where I am now? And do I like the impact that I'm having on people and the ability to be able to give people hope in their darkness?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And so, but it doesn't change the sadness that went with the other thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, like, you and I can talk about where we're at now. We can accept that, there's a part of this that even if it doesn't feel like a gift, has been a gift to other people. But that took time.
Oh yeah, not in 5 seconds.
Yeah, this wasn't
three
like
easy steps.
Okay, like I always think, when like when you're a high schooler and you're dating somebody or you're not dating somebody, but you want to be dating somebody, it's like the moment you stop trying is like the moment, so you find that that person or whatever. And so you're like, okay, I'm just gonna stop trying. Okay, God, like I'm done trying.
Done trying.
And that's kind of how it works, at least in my experience. How it worked for me is, like, I was able to get to that point when I stopped trying. When I just kind of hit the end of like, okay, I'm gonna stop trying to control this thing. Yeah. But there was no point. Like, a decade's worth of treatment, hospitalizations, and stuff like. There was no like, oh, okay, that'll happen tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. It does not work that way.
Yeah. we're going to talk in just a little bit about, how to find a therapist and kind of the practical end. But as if somebody is watching today and they're they're wrestling with these misconceptions, maybe they are seeing a therapist, but they've got people in their lives where it's like hard to communicate what is actually going on. Is there encouragement that you would give, or like, hey, this is something that I would tell a family member if they just didn't understand what I was experiencing?
That's hard.
Yeah.
Because when you are in that desperate of a place, it's hard to articulate sometimes like how you really feel. Because I know, like, when I would try to express like, no, I really think I'm dying, it almost sounded like I was crazy, right? And trying to convince even people that I loved and meant the most to me and wanted to understand, like, it's like they couldn't, And so being one of those people, like trying to help a loved one through something or whatever, I mean, I think asking, like, explain to me, like, how do you feel, whatever. Don't minimize how they're feeling. Don't try to brush it away. Also, don't threaten. I know a lot of parents do this. They'll threaten therapy, like it's like some terrible thing, Yeah. Well, do I need to take you to a therapist? It's like, do not do that. Like, the last thing you want to do is paint therapy in some kind of like threatening light, right?
Yeah, it's not a punishment.
No, not at all.
Like you said, it's that safe place. Like, it's an hour that should be a safe place. And we wouldn't talk about like Chuck E. Cheese that way, right? It's like,
right, yeah.
If you don't behave, I'm going to take you to Chuck E. Cheese. It's like, no, because that's a fun place. This is that kind of environment that you want to build.
Exactly. So I think the threat of that, or even the threat of the hospital, like if you have someone in your family who's struggling with depression or anxiety or whatever mental illness, and you start throwing around, well, do I need to take you to the hospital? Do I need to take you to the hospital again? And it's like, stop using those things as punishment, because then that's going to exacerbate their shame and fear, and then they're going to feel like they have to try to like, oh no, I'm fine, when they're really not.
Yeah.
I think authenticity is probably the best remedy for all of that. Like, let's just sit down and talk, and just to create that safe space with a family member or a close friend. Like, I'm not doing okay. Like, I need you to understand, like, I'm not doing okay. Will you help me try to find someone to help me? But that takes a lot of courage. That's why it's not weakness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us this week on Midweek. I want to say a big thank you to our guest, Suzie Lawyer. Now, our conversation, we had so much in our conversation that we wanted to break it up into 2 parts. So you just saw part 1 of our conversation. Next week on Midweek, we'll be releasing part 2 of my conversation with Suzie Lawyer, where we dive into a lot more about faith and mental health. So I hope that you'll join us next week as well. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe on our YouTube channel and share it out on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to get the word out about Midweek. Again, thank you so much. We'll see you back here next week.